Welcome to everyone to the very early 6:30 that looks a bit darker than it normally does. But this morning we have Wayne speaking to us. This morning's talk is a follow-up on his previous talk in July. And that talk ended with the following quote, where he quoted Michael Gorman: "The greatest privilege," Paul suggests, "is to be part of this new creation, to participate in the very purpose of God for humanity, becoming the embodiment of God's saving, reconciling, restorative justice in the world." Over to you, Wayne.
Thanks, Rafadi. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you again. And as Rafadi mentioned, this is a follow-up from the last talk, and that talk is online. So I'm hoping not to sort of lay the same, maybe laborious foundation as I did last time. And we'll refer to even Michael Gorman again and others. Yeah, but this morning I want to follow on from the issue of righteousness and justice, and specifically land on the topic of peace and peacemakers. So Psalm 85 verse 10 says, if it jumps across, "Love and faithfulness meet one another. Righteousness and peace kiss each other." And then obviously the famous quote by Jesus that we know very well on the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." So obviously peace is a huge issue in our time. I think it probably has always been throughout world history. And I was just sort of laughing, chuckling yesterday, you know, when they used to do the beauty pageants and ask all the participants, you know, what do you want for the world? And it sort of, normally it was world peace, but we're not going to talk about it in that context this morning. I want to look particularly at how Paul refers to peace. And I thought I'd sort of jump into his epistle to the Ephesians. And so my apologies to those of you from Hillside, because I've been sharing from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I'll just refer to that this morning as a bit of a springboard. And that letter is quite interesting because, you know, Paul seems to write often in a very fiery way to local congregations, whether it's Galatians or Corinth or the region of Galatia. And, you know, he's addressing certain concerns and issues that are happening in the different places with people. Ephesians is probably a circular letter. And given the nature of that, he's not specifically writing to a local church, addressing sort of problems with people or specific crises and that kind of thing. If it is possibly that circular letter, it's this well-rounded letter that could be read in any church, and certainly conveying to the early Christians and to us a broader understanding of Paul's understanding of Jesus, of the cross, of the kingdom. So yeah, the noun peace in that letter appears no less than 8 times. And the letter itself is almost wrapped in peace, with its references in the opening and closing, which is not that uncommon, because Paul often does that. He starts his letters with a greeting: "Grace and peace to you from our God, from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." And here in this letter he ends, as I said, you know, grace and peace particularly frames the whole letter as he ends off in verse 23 of chapter 6. "Peace to the brothers and sisters, and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." In chapter 2, many scholars view chapter 2 as an amazing summary of Paul's gospel, and I'll read a little bit of that later. The theological substance of what Paul is sort of getting into is in fact peace. And then peace and reconciliation are clustered about 5 times. As well as that, he then calls the inner life of the church to a life of peace in chapter 4. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And then most interestingly is that, again, well-known passage in chapter 6 where he talks about the armor of God, but he actually refers to the gospel as the gospel of peace, that our feet would be fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And some scholars go as far to say that the message of Ephesians can be summarized by that signature phrase, that the core message of this letter is in fact the gospel of peace. So as with the last talk, again, I wanted to sort of jump back to the Jewish, perhaps, heritage or background. Obviously, we understand that Paul and the first followers of Jesus himself, would have been so immersed in their Hebrew heritage. And the word in the New Testament, obviously the Greek word, would come with the weight of the meaning of shalom, peace within its Jewish heritage. And peace has a wide range of meanings in the Old Testament, but shalom is just an incredibly rich word. So one scholar, Cornelius Plantinga, very reformed scholar, talking about sin and the effect of sin in the world, says that shalom is more than just peace. It is the webbing together of God, humans, and all creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight. Universal flourishing, wholeness and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed. Shalom, in other words, is the way that things are supposed to be. So again, we see this incredibly rich word. Jews were familiar with this word. Shalom embodied everything that God wanted for his people and his world. It was a daily greeting. It was the way people would greet one another in Jesus and in Paul's world. But again, it meant so much more than just peace. It was all this, the way things were meant to be as God has created us, to live well with him and with one another. In the Roman world, again, the socio-political world of the early church and the New Testament, peace then was a hugely politically charged word. So most of us are probably familiar with the Pax Romana from Asterix and Obelix, if you read those as children. If you had a deprived childhood and you never read Asterix and Obelix, I certainly recommend that you, in order to understand the New Testament, it would be a good thing maybe to familiarize yourself with Asterix and Obelix. Please don't quote that, I'll get into such trouble from some of my friends. But Rome had this battle cry, this cry of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. But peace for Rome, in actual fact, was quite brutal. They subdued nations, and where they invaded and took over places, even like Palestine and further east and to the west, they would obviously then occupy that area, and Rome had a way of incredibly brutally stamping out any opposition or unrest. And in the world of Jesus and Judea, where Jesus ministered and preached his gospel at that time, it was absolutely no exception. And Pilate himself was ruthless. So peace for the Romans had a completely different sense in terms of the Jews, and yet they were familiar with this thing. It's interesting, I was thinking, we don't have to get into it now, but global peacekeeping today sometimes is a little bit more characteristic of Rome than it is of Jesus. But the significance of Rome is quite interesting, because, I mean, particularly the way that Rome would enforce peace. Their favorite method for non-Roman citizens would in actual fact be crucifixion, the most brutal way that this global superpower could enforce terror and subdue people into peace. And so it's incredibly significant and ironic that then the cross becomes the chief mechanism for God to play out his plan for peace for our world. So Paul articulates this in all of his writings. We looked at that last time, particularly Romans and others, but in all his writings he refers to this. And in Ephesians particularly, we struck with the cosmic plan or the cosmic dimensions of God's plan of salvation. So the coming of Jesus, God's Messiah, his message, his ministry that culminates in the cross, is the fulfillment of God's promises for all of Israel. In actual fact, it's the cross, the sending of Jesus and his ministry, culminating in the cross, is part of God's peace mission for humanity. As I said, Jesus comes in fulfillment of all that Yahweh has promised to Israel. And he dies on the cross, instituting this new covenant and inaugurating God's plan, not just for humanity, but for the entire cosmos. The plan was always the whole world, ending, being fulfilled in terms of the new humanity and ending with a new heaven and a new earth. And so part of what, answering Ruchari's question that she started with, but part of what I often think about is, and I'm struck with even when I first came into ministry, is how we have diminished that gospel. The gospel that meant so much to me in my teenage years was very much just this personal rescue plan. And for me, the challenge has been to see the broader scope of this message, that it was always far bigger than that. I think historically, post-Enlightenment evangelicals particularly have kind of reduced it simply to how do we get to heaven? So in a sense, it's like, this passport to heaven, fire insurance, as we often like to call it. So looking a little bit at the gospel in Ephesians chapter 2, and sorry, not trying to make this a Bible study, but allow me just to read some of this theologically charged language in that Paul uses. But a beautiful passage, even just from verse 14, says that talking about the cross and the ministry of Jesus, Paul says, he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law and its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both now have access to the Father by one Spirit. So consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. In him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Again, a very powerful and incredible passage where we see that language where Paul talks about the fact that Jesus came to create in himself one new humanity, breaking down these barriers between us and God and one another. And so in Galatians, Paul says there's no Jew nor Greek, there's no slave nor free, there's no male nor female. So we often refer to this as, we talk about the cross having these vertical and horizontal characteristics or implications. But so often what we don't perhaps see or emphasize enough is the inseparability of these two directions, if I can put it like that. We seem to emphasize this thing of, yes, we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our strength, and then to love our neighbor as ourselves. But sometimes the way, well, certainly I first understood it and perhaps articulated is that, we have to get this first aspect right in order for everything else to play out. And again, in one sense, I don't disagree with that. But what often happens, perhaps even subliminally or subconsciously, is that, I'm a work in progress. Much or a few others in this Zoom perhaps are. And because we're not perfect, because we haven't been transformed completely, there becomes this sort of subversive excuse. Well, I just need to continue to work on my relationship with God, and then perhaps it'll help me in terms of my relationship with others. And just to say that as I've been, again, just looking at the gospel, I've done a few talks on that for TGIF. When you look at Jesus's teaching, and when you look at the way Paul understood and articulated the gospel, again, for him, these two dimensions were completely inseparable. And when it comes to issues of justice, social justice, the church being involved in peace and peacemaking, perhaps it would help that if we could understand for ourselves that the nature of the gospel, the intention of Jesus's message and what he did on the cross is in actual fact both and these things always are being held together and playing out together at the same time. So perhaps I could, best summarized by Jesus even in the Lord's Prayer, where he says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those that sin against us. And then in Matthew 5, where he says as well that if you are offering a sin, if you bring offering a gift, if you bring your gift to the altar and remember that a brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift right there. Just stop exactly what you're doing. Just pause right there and go and be reconciled, because this can't work. You can't have this relationship with God in isolation of relationship with others. The two play in to one another, and we're always meant to be affected by one another. So, one example to use is to say that obviously we understand, and I've certainly understood, what it is to feel reconciled with God, to experience forgiveness of sin, to know his unfailing love and his grace that is always poured out on my life where I've not deserved it. That is the nature of grace, is that I could never earn this. I could never buy this. There's nothing I can do to deserve it. And that has profoundly touched my life. But sometimes we forget that in my interaction with others, there are opportunities where other people can demonstrate grace, can extend love to me, that gives me a deeper understanding, that itself, of God's love for me. It's not always just he loves me and then I can love others. Others love me, and I realize that I'm profoundly loved by the Father. Hopefully that makes sense. So just to talk a little bit about Paul in summary, a few things about this, about peace and peacemaking, and then I wanted to get into some examples this morning. But for Paul, the practice of Christ-shaped peacemaking is in fact to participate in the life and mission of God, whose very nature is revealed more fully in Christ, in Jesus himself, this peacemaker. It is peaceable. Romans 5 says we have peace with God. This peace of God, his shalom, affects us. It's meant to rub off on us. And then it's also peacemaking, being reconciled with others. And so perhaps to practice and to make peace is to participate in the very character of God, in his divine nature. And again, that was part of the point that I made about justice. Justice is not just something that God is concerned about, righteousness and justice. It is the very nature of the divine Trinity himself. So Michael Gorman, I quoted last time, and which Ruchadi referred to, he talks about peace churches, where, churches have said, they like peace churches because they are involved in peacekeeping and that. And he says, well, that's a completely redundant term. Sadly, however, it's more often than not somewhat of an oxymoron. But he says that peace churches is theologically repetitive because the gospel that the church has been given is God's peace initiative. So to state it a little bit more forcefully, there is no other gospel than the gospel of peace. Peace both as peaceableness, if that's even a word, and peacemaking. It's not a supplement to the gospel, but it's a non-negotiable and constitute element of it. So in fact, peacemaking between humanity and God, between people and other people, is arguably for Paul the central reality that Christ's death affects. And that gospel makes known and makes real this sense of peace, I think, perhaps should be in everyday situations. So let's turn a little bit to our context. Obviously with peace, and I haven't quoted all the scriptures, with peace is the sense of peace and reconciliation. We've been reconciled with God, and he calls us to be reconciled with one another, particularly here in chapter 2, where he's talking about Jews and Gentiles and a new humanity. Our issue and our heritage and our history in this country has not been, where the rubber hits the road. It hasn't been between, Jews and Gentiles. It's been between black and white, between the haves and the have-nots, and this complex melting pool that we find ourselves in South Africa. So there's a picture on your screen of Bishop Tutu. But my upbringing was, apologies Ruchadi, within an Anglican church where Ruchadi in actual fact did her internship. So very, very white, suburban Johannesburg congregation, St. Thomas's. And there were people at that stage, the Methodist minister, Alan Bussack, the NGO Dominee up the road, Baz Nordia, and our own Bishop Tutu. And quite interestingly, I think in sort of the northern and northwestern suburbs of Johannesburg, certainly for a lot of people, Bishop Tutu was somewhat of a pariah, because he just sort of was always talking about apartheid and politics and that kind of thing. And, everyone just wanted to get on with life, and as it were, at that stage. But I remember a very iconic moment. I'm sure others, even like Rory, would remember. There was even a picture of Desmond Tutu inserting himself in the midst of this angry mob, where there was this just awful practice of necklacing in the 80s. And I remember this picture of Bishop Tutu literally grabbing hold and hanging on to this young boy in the midst of this really just riotous crowd, and holding them back and saving his life by literally putting his own life on the line. That he was just incredibly involved on the ground. And, you know, it's only later that I began to understand it. How did he, as a Christian minister, as a pastor, as a bishop, manage to do that? And obviously, this for him, this was not politics. This was the gospel. Here was a young man who was made in the image of Christ. Here was someone who was intended to be part of this new humanity. And Bishop Tutu's understanding of the gospel was what could place him and literally put his own life on the line. I was privileged, as I said, as a young man. He was not a hero in some of the circles that I grew up in, but later I actually got to meet him and encountered this just incredibly humble man and very godly man. I met him with some other Anglican ministers, and he never shared this, but others shared this with me, that as a bishop, he would pray for his priests and their families and their wives every single day. And some ministers were struck by the fact that he would greet wives and family by name that he'd never met before. And anyhow, you can talk about stories like that. So that, just one example. Within our own denomination, I have colleagues and friends like Trevin Flawler and Alexander Fenter, and they're the ones who have walked a long journey of reconciliation. Alexander, a colleague of mine, has written a book called Doing Reconciliation, and coming out of this literally a lifetime of ministry, of doing reconciliation in this country. And just to say, the point there is that this issue of justice, specifically racial reconciliation, is not for them, a political aside from church and ministry and the gospel. In actual fact, it was inspired by their understanding of this is what God has done for them and for us. This is what God calls us to. So another story, we did as a video, we did a racial dialogue a little while ago, and a younger pastor who's recently moved into a different area and pastoring a new church in a sort of more rural and a lot of farmers and that kind of thing. And he was so inspired by this racial dialogue that he wanted to preach on the Sunday. So the following Sunday he got up and he preached on reconciliation. And interestingly enough, he had two families that said, we're out of here. We're leaving this church. We're not interested in politics. And so that is unfortunately the way that often the church, certainly the Paler constituency of the church in South Africa, has understood that. And again, we need to say, but have you even understood the gospel then? Certainly what I quoted earlier, if I go up to that note, peacemakers have the DNA of God, and those who claim to have that DNA should in fact be peacemakers. So a challenge and then a discipline, I think, for us as followers of Jesus, as believers, and for the church. But the first challenge for me is that And I've heard this in, the last few weeks, I heard this in response to my talk and in response to Vera's talk when she was talking. I loved her topic. The world is a light to the church. Has the world become the light of the church? But often when we talk about, specifically Vera's talk last week on racial dialogue, if I talk about now peace as reconciliation, often there's a comment and an attitude that comes through that says the church should be the place that this happens. And almost if it can only happen if it first happens in and through the church. And so on the one hand, when we read Paul, you could certainly, because Paul is writing to churches, that's the message that we have. You could see it like that. But I think that can become problematic in certain respects. We could go into a whole long thing of, if you read Acts, Paul didn't only go to the churches. He went first to the synagogue. He went into the marketplaces. He proclaimed this gospel, and he expected it to affect the whole world. When he wrote his letters, he then wrote to these local churches. So I don't disagree with that. But here's a problem, is that the church, and certainly the church in South Africa, has often been complicit in terms of injustice, inequality in all its forms, whether to gender, whether to different races, etc., etc. So the church, and here I speak as a pastor, the church is made up of broken people in need of the gospel. So again, we must be careful not to say that, we first need to get this right in the church, and then we can perhaps get it right. Next, say hello to everyone. Good morning. Get it right in terms of the world. The other issue there is to think of Israel in the Old Testament, because sometimes where the church becomes complacent, or even, as I said, complicit, in the Old Testament, Yahweh used Assyria, Babylon, to wake his people up. And I think the same could be true today in terms of movements that we see around the world, whether it be Black Lives Matter or many others. Right, so just to say that what I often hear is this thing also within churches, is that I mentioned this just now, we need to focus on the gospel. Certainly as a pastor, we sometimes think, well, we need to focus on the work of the church, worship, our Sunday services, discipleship, preaching, just getting people saved, evangelism, and then everything else will sort of take place. And with that, we see people, I see there's a lot of my colleagues, Vera is someone who is involved in issues of peacekeeping, justice, social justice, reconciliation. And then what the church does is we sort of do this thing of, okay, well, you can do that over there. That is not perhaps the core of what we should be doing as a church. And as I said, sometimes when churches engage with that, people leave because it seemed to be political. But the challenge is to say, this is in actual fact the very heart of the gospel itself. And what I hear in that sometimes is, we're very happy the way we are. Please don't disrupt the status quo. Leave us the way we are. So I want to suggest, I'm sure there's some discussion that can come out of that, certainly, but perhaps a discipline that I certainly need to practice a lot more in terms of being at peace and making peace with others. And that discipline would be listening. To quote, I often quote this in our church, Karl Barth famously said, read the Bible with one hand and the newspaper with another. And so often what is happening in the world, we can be reading the newspaper, looking at the news, being aware of what's happening in the world around us. And at the same time, we're reading our Bible and we're saying, what is God's opinion on this? How are we called to engage with these very issues? And sometimes the issues are blowing up in the world around us and not necessarily in the church. So if we use Black Lives Matter just as a nice example to upset some people this morning, but what I often see, and again, this is just my experience, is this very knee-jerk reaction with Christians in particular, and with perhaps a lot of white people, if I can put it like that. So obviously, being a white male over 50, my Facebook profile has a lot of followers of that demographic, and just so, I mean, just a complete aside, with Nick's over here joining us for the Zoom. I really don't like engaging with debates and heavy topics on Facebook. I think they're best kept for either posting pictures of my cats or inviting people to TGIF, where we can, perhaps do this in a better forum. But it's just quite interesting to see the different demographics of when this whole Black Lives Matter plays out, and people respond with the hashtag all lives matter, of course. And again, I see that often within the church, within myself, within Christians particularly, this very quick defense mechanism to be defensive. Have you ever been in a discussion with someone, perhaps a bit of a heated debate, and you're trying to put your point across, and as you're talking with someone, you can see this person is just waiting to respond, and then do you ever struck with the fact of, they haven't even let me finish. I haven't even said what I wanted to say, and they're busy loading. They're sort of lock and loading so they can shoot back at you. And so I would suggest and challenge us, and again, my family would be throwing things at me at the moment. The challenge to myself is to listen more and to learn, if we are going to engage with the peacemaking mission of the Messiah, bringing people into a place of peace with him and with one another, I submit to you that we are going to have to listen a lot more, and certainly hone our skill of listening, if I can put it like that. So I see that in the whole issue of the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter thing, which you're welcome to chat with me about afterwards. The other one, far more controversial, that was, well, not far more controversial, but another controversial one, is the hashtag Men Are Trash. That's a particularly South African one. And I'm sure, there might be a lot of people in this room that haven't heard of it. It was a hashtag that was trending on social media a while back. I'm going to close this down now. And so again, what happens is that as a white, over 50-year-old male, and I see that, everything by nature in me recoils and wants to defend and wants to explain myself and explain why that cannot be biblical at all. And I have the opportunity, I have the huge privilege of having two young daughters, and not so young anymore as I look at the one. And the privilege has been able to talk to them and walk with them. And we go on these long walks. And what has really helped me is to be able to walk with these young adults and say, talk to me about this. Where did this originate? How did this thing start? What is this all about? And in the end, I could tell you so many stories. Perhaps I should just indulge myself. But at the end, I'm left often with a feeling of, yeah, we are trash. My eldest daughter went off to the University of Rhodes, And with two daughters, I mean, for the first time, you're sending your children away from home, and they're not just going up the road, they're going across the country and staying in a res. And as a father, as a mother, as parents, the issue is, what is the security? Girls need to buzz themselves in, they need to sign in, there's areas where the boys can be, etc., etc. The campus, I see that at UCT with my other daughter, there are blue routes with panic buttons where girls are told at night, this is where you can walk safely on campus. As in, well, men can walk anywhere, but this is where you can walk. Again, I was at university as a teenager, and that I was a young man, but my daughter then told me of accounts in the men's reses where you would go into the common rooms and there would be, what were they, dartboards and things with all these scores. And the girls were always corralled together and at initiation explained that those are not keeping score of darts. The practice with initiation or orientation week is what at Rhodes in Grahamstown was called seal clubbing. And the young first-year girls were seen as seals, and every girl that you managed to sleep with or conquer would then go up on the dartboard as a score with all your other mates, you know, like as guys would obviously say, you know, score. So again, and there's so many accounts, so many of that was just one that, as you can imagine, as a parent of a young girl, was completely horrified. And to walk with girls and talk to them about their engagement with men and say, my role as a man is not to defend and argue that hashtag. It is to start with listening, and then I think more biblically, self-examination and repentance, where we as men go, yeah, there's stuff that we have to own here. And then obviously we get to say, but what has God called us to? What is the vision of this new humanity? How can we be the people that God has called us to? How can we embrace and live in an understanding of shalom? But the challenge is to be peacemakers on a mission of peace that God initiated in his world. So just on that issue, last example from Dallas Willard, famous late philosopher and Christian writer, in terms of this discipline. Dallas Willard was ending a lecture, and it's quoted quite famously. John Ortberg tells the story in one of his books, and I've heard it from other people as well. But there was a question and answer period at the end of a lecture, and a young, very obnoxious student challenged Dallas Willard on certain things and really sort of took him on. And Dallas Willard responded and he said, yeah, well, thank you for that. I think that's a good place to end the lecture, and we'll call it a day for today. And some of the people in the auditorium were completely stunned. And the one young man went to him afterwards and said, you could have just obliterated that argument. How could you leave that man like that? And Dallas Willard simply said, I'm trying to practice not having the last say. And that is still a challenge for me today. Thank you. Let's hear some questions and comments. Over to you, Rukhadi.
Oh, thank you. Please unmute yourself or just raise your blue hand for questions and comments. I think while we're waiting, I had, when you started mentioning the peacekeeping part of it, and I was wondering, is it maybe not a question of the philosophy, especially in terms of global peacekeeping? Is there not a problem of the philosophy that is being used? And then also the fact that the training is the same, most of it is very similar to if you're going to war. And so how do we begin to understand where we're going wrong with our global peacekeeping efforts?
It's quite interesting, but also had some discussions with my daughter in terms of the whole Black Lives Matter movement in the States. And you see the response to police violence and that is exactly the point. I mean, perhaps, maybe someone like Rory has more insight into this, but where police are trained in certain parts of the world to draw their guns, to shoot, etc., etc. They're not essentially trained in peacekeeping in that sense. But I mean, there's some wonderful stories. We'll hear some of where churches in the world are engaging in being observers and actually just being inspired by this mission of peace, where they're going into conflict situations and actually in fact, to be a presence and witnesses to peace. But yeah, our defense forces and that are not normally trained like that, I don't think.
No. Fred, I see your hand is up. Or is it Cheryl?
Right. Cheryl, yeah.
We never know.
Yeah. Great presentation. So my question, back with the picture that you had of the horizontal and vertical, and you said we sometimes in church we get stuck loving God, and we say let's fix that, and the more we love God, then eventually we'll do the neighbor thing, which is the vertical. I thought where you were going, or horizontal, I thought where you were going to say maybe we should notice the people who are actually doing that horizontal thing, that they join them there, because maybe that is how they will learn to love God better. So I'm not talking about Christians, quote unquote. I'm just talking about people who are living the life of shalom there. If I speak into their lives that they are actually demonstrating this DNA of God, it will help them then not be blind to, oh, well, if this is what God is about, then maybe I can join the kingdom business. That's where I thought you were going.
And it's a good point, and I think, if you look at the church in history, sometimes, even, the Catholic Church and others, I mean, sometimes there are churches that have engaged in that horizontal in a way of just loving, demonstrating, engaging with the poor, engaging with mission. And it's through hospitals and poverty relief and that kind of thing that then people have engaged with the vertical. I mean, again, and it's my experience, my coming into the church, and that it's always been, for me, it was first get this right, and then engage with that. And I've discovered 30 years later in ministry, I'm still getting this right.
Do we have anybody else? Thank you.
So I was just thinking about this idea of peacekeeping and how we're doing it, and I think part of the struggle is that actually that might be a wrong label. It's not really peacekeeping; it's trying to make peace. So it's peacemaking. But obviously, I think when we're sending soldiers in there, that's really the last resort. The steps before have been somewhat overlooked of peacemaking. And I know that there are strides in the AU and in the UN to try and reconfigure what actually peacemaking or peacekeeping would look like. So sending not just soldiers on the ground, but people who are interested in social development, in healthcare. So I think that there's slowly a realization that actually it takes more than just soldiers to make peace, to enforce peace, because you're dealing with when people go into conflicts, you are dealing with a lot more than just people not fighting each other. You're dealing with identity, you're dealing with social issues that have made war inevitable to some extent. So you need to address those social issues in order to make peace, or to bring about peace, or to keep peace or maintain peace. So that's just, I just wanted to say that quickly.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. And I mean, surely it should be those of us that have our lives have been transformed by the gospel. There should be so many of us that are saying, here is this world vision for God's world that enables and empowers us to be doing those things out there when they need it most. Yeah.
So I was thinking, Wayne, about, when you spoke about the horizontal and the vertical, how it reminds me of the lines that run across the earth, which is the longitude and latitude, right? And how those are geographic coordinate points. And I was just thinking how, if you're going to find yourself and situate yourself on the earth, anywhere on the earth, you can use a latitude and a longitude. And that's your spirituality and your humanity intersecting. And so, if we think of a distance that I have to Wayne, a distance I might have to Rahadi, it's a distance that I can negotiate in terms of my vertical and my horizontal, and where she is vertically and horizontally, and then find myself there. Anyway, it's I wish I wish we were together in person. Then I would maybe even put a diagram down or whatever. But it's just really fascinating to think that I think we can always find ourselves in terms of our humanity and our spirituality, in terms of ourselves, but in terms of other people as well. And in its principle, the GPS, it works literally horizontal and vertical in that way. Anyway, it's just the thought. If it triggers something, a response or any kind of comment from you, I'd appreciate that. Cool.
Yeah, just something to think about. I don't have an initial response. I mean, maybe someone else does, but yeah, I must think about that. Thank you.
So I was just looking back at the Beatitudes, and the way that it says, blessed be the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. So to me, it really does put together again both of those, the horizontal and the vertical. That because of the horizontal, it points to our relationship with God. So it actually really is what you were saying, the gospel of peace. If we are peacemakers, then we are living out the gospel and pointing to our relationship with God. But I was actually going to just ask you, in terms of, you talked about the role of men. Well, you started talking about your daughters and some of the things that they've told you about the Men Are Trash hashtag. And then I was going to ask you, how do you pull that through to being a peacemaker, as being a man? And what are the possibilities of putting that through, especially in light of things like gender-based violence being so much, in the news at the moment and having our attention?
Sure. I mean, that's a huge one, Vera, and obviously lots. I think we could do more talks on that completely, but I certainly think, and I can only respond from my side, is again, this, whether it's whatever's happening in the news and with people. So in terms of racial reconciliation, in terms of this country, in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of young people, in terms of women, this thing of saying, men have traditionally been in a place of power. Men are used to being heard. We like to speak. We like to chair meetings. I'm much happier if I chair a meeting and everyone listens to me. That's my happy place. The amazing thing about Zoom is that I can do church and mute everyone, and I feel like the kingdom has come. And the harsh reality is to say, how do I place myself in a position of humility, of surrender, and listen and hear and not respond? And then, as I said, whether it's personally or on behalf of white people, white males, men, say, we have sinned. Isaiah 6, I just love, where Isaiah just sees the Lord and he says, woe is me, because I'm unclean. I see my culpability and I live amongst the people who are unclean. So I think, for me, I think that again, I said this in the talk, but I think that for me has become the challenge, is to say that we've always been in this place of power, of speaking, of what you said yesterday, and my wife says this. So last example, but my wife and other businesswomen say that when they're in a panel, it's invariably white men and there's a woman. And then if they speak, the first person to respond is a man in the audience. And just how I've had to sort of like acclimatize myself to that and say, own it, and change my behavior. I don't know if that answers a bit of your question. So that's a part of it. A small part.
Yeah, so I think it's a very important part. And I think sometimes, because like what you were saying with that power, how the question to sort of develop is how can one use that power to give the platform to more women? And maybe even ask a woman her opinion in that kind of setup. I think it's a great thing to explore.
Yeah, and it's a road we have to walk and learn and relearn. I'm learning. There were some other hands up. I'll stop talking.
So just in terms of some of the hashtags that you spoke about, men are trash, and then the Black Lives Movement, I'm just trying to find out from you, Wayne, if a guy came up to you, okay, and said there is no such thing as, so I suppose the question is, how would you answer somebody who does not believe that there is such a thing as systematic race or patriarchy, and that it is actually just an individual thing, and so those people who have bad experiences should deal with it on an individual level, and there isn't this overarching narrative of patriarchy and racism. How would you answer them?
No, I would say get an education, read the paper, open your eyes. But yeah, again, I think the other people would love to hear Rachadi's opinion on that. I don't know why I'm always saying that, but just get in relationship, build some friendships, get into some dialogue where you can listen and hear people's pain, because it's a sea of pain out there. That would be my response is so let me say it like this, Simosa, is that perhaps the doorway into systematic injustice is through building bridges and relationships with individuals and their stories, so that it's not it's not first the system, it's a face and a voice and hearing the individualized pain. Would you agree with that, Miss RK?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good start rather than generalizing. It's a good start to start with the individual. Ndoluma.
So I'm really quite challenged by everything that's been said and some of the reflections that have come in the discussion. So thank you to all you guys, because there I am championing this cause for racial equality and fairness, and yet I am, within the framework of my blind spots, perpetuating the sort of pain and oppression that other people are experiencing because of my blind spots. It's just simply a place I can't relate to. So I'm doing things which I feel are natural, but in fact it accrues as pain for somebody else. So this has been a real gospel moment for me and this morning. I think a real place for repentance. I think God is saying something to me. In fact, I recognize that He is, because people in my Connect group, when we met on Wednesday, were talking about some of the ladies were talking about the experiences. And it was quite, I remember just having this knee-jerk reaction to some of the things they were saying that you were talking about, Wayne. And I'm like, no, but it's not like that. But I'm thinking, why am I defending? I'm really just trying to come out clean here. I'm betting house money, not my own. I'm trying to shore up my insurance here. But I think the gospel is really, the rub really is about the things that the blind spots that we don't know, that create offense, and the things that we do as well that we might not intend to, but still create offense, and it just speaks to the brokenness. So thank you. I'm thankful, because for me it's a gospel moment. I really need to dig into by raising. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the mic here, but I'm the last person to speak, Wayne. So if you can practice what Dallas Willard said, you won't have the last word. I'll have the last word. But just honestly, this quest to try and align with things that you feel very passionately about often could be at the expense of recognizing the pain others are experiencing, and that's my takeout for me. I'm gonna leave it there.
Thanks, Ndoluma. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.